Okay, so in this tutorial I'm going to explain the basics of procedural texturing in Blender cycles. So we delete the default cube, add a UV sphere and smooth it, add a subdivision surface to, as you can see the UV sphere is here. So we'll first add a material to the plane, call it ground, and first I'm going to teach you how to make a ground material. It will be a simple wood material. So it's a default wood texture, diffuse texture. So I'll add a mix shader with it, and I'll add a glossy shader. Okay, now I can add a rice texture, a color ramp. This color goes here, and input texture coordinate. I go with generated and vector mapping, texture, as you can see it's starting to look like a wood texture now. I'll increase the scale further to a 40. And 50 for this. Okay, so we've got this nice lines, and I'll increase the distortion to 1. Or 4, and detail to 7. Now we can play around with these colors. First I'll make the dark color right now the colors are not looking that good, so I'm going to play around with them. And okay, now I'll decrease the roughness and add a and make it 0.5. So we have this. Okay. And we can also play around with some more colors. you see, we've got this simple shiny wood. It's too shiny. Okay, I'll make this even darker. And okay, now at the moment I believe some things for example I go with 30. Okay, now I plug this nice texture, add a vector bump. Back of this goes to the height, and at the moment it's taking a long time because I have enabled this. I have enabled multiple importance. So I'll just remove it for now. Now let's make the strength to a 0.3 and add a math node. Duplicate this, add a new texture, noise texture. We can use wave texture also for the wooden surface. Now I think this is better. Okay, and add a bit of distortion. Reduce okay, I go with the noise texture for this, and we can use B-spline, and we can use a lighter color. Yeah. See, now it's looking more like some wooden surface. Okay, now this is the surface. I'll add a new material to this sphere, and I'll go over all the default textures we have here, which are all procedural. So first I'll go with a noise texture. Noise texture we just use right now in making the wood surface. So on this you can see that it's a noise. Now I can duplicate this. Okay, so this was the noise texture. I'll add a new material to this, and in place of the noise texture, for this I'll use a wave texture. So this, as you can see, it has bands and rings. I'll cover these in both of these in more detail. The third, I'll add a new material and I'll delete this. I'll add Voronoi texture, and fourth, Musgrave, fifth, gradient, and magic, and I'll duplicate this and add a new texture, checker, and add a new texture to this, brick. So these are the basic textures which we have available in Blender, and we can mix or modify these to make different kinds of textures. So I'll cover all of these in details. First of all, we have the noise texture, which is in this, the first sphere. So if I go over here, if I connect the FAC, it will turn into a black and white image. If I connect it to a mix RGB node and I put it into the FAC, and I use green, dark green color for one, and I use a dark blue color for another. So I get this kind of an effect. Now I can add a vector bump and plug it in the normals, and I can add a texture noise, plug it to the height and scale it to 50, so we get these bumpy effects. Okay, now You can also add mix shader and add the normals to this as well to make it nice looking. Maybe a planet, maybe reduce the scale to 20, or a ball or a stone in a sci-fi environment. So you can do many other things with this. You can also use in place of a mix node, you can also use a color ramp, and so here we now have to change the colors again, but we can apply a lot of different kinds of effects here. For example, I choose B-spline and now I can get this varied effect. We can also choose ease. Same thing with the wood texture we created earlier. I can go here and make it more prominent. And now I can decrease the strength to maybe a 0.6 or 0.3 and try to invert it. 0.5. Okay, so let's see now what we can do with this wave texture. Okay, we can increase the distortion. The more we increase, and we can increase the detail as well, scale, and we can increase it. You can also create dirt terrains using this nice texture. It just doesn't apply to this planet kind of setting. Dirt, any kind. You can also use it in walls or roads to create those bumps. And you can use this wave texture so a color ramp and change the colors. Maybe add mix it with a nice texture and mix shader, vector bump. Again, apply this to the height of the diffuse shader as well as the glossy shader. decrease this fag. I'm just removing the facing node from the wood texture, and okay, now we can go 500 on this. Too much, I believe. 30. This is a nice texture. This is the wave texture with bumps of the noise. We can also use it, the wave texture itself, as a bump, so we get this nice bumps on it. Also, now we can play around with this. We can make it rings. Not much of a difference on a sphere, but it will be different on other kinds of objects. So this is our wave texture modified. Now let's see what we can do with the Voronoi. Same thing, color, everything. I'll just do it. I'll just copy this and change this to a Voronoi texture. Now see, this has a similar effect than this, but it's a bit different in that there's two different types. First of all, cells and intensity, which we can increase the size and do other things as well. Now I can change it to different kinds of things. Ease, I'll go with E-spline, which is smoother. Ease is also smooth. E-spline is better for this. And now this is just using the Voronoi texture. Now note that if we make it cells, these bumps don't look that good. Maybe on some objects, but not good otherwise. But yeah, if I go with intensity, we can have these nice bumpy effects, and I can also increase the scale of it to 30 or maybe a little less. This also looks like a good material, but I'll go with a little less. Yeah. So now let's see what we can do with this. First I'll save this. Okay, now this Musgrave texture can also be can add a color ampere as well, make it B-spline so that it becomes smoother, and Musgrave adds different other effects. It's similar to the noise, but it has different shape a little bit. We can increase the detail, we can increase the dimension. Okay, and we can change what different kind of setting we want it to be. So now same things apply to this, and I'll go over some advanced techniques covering this in this tutorial or maybe in some other tutorial, but for now I'll apply all those same techniques to this as well. And I'll add a bump node and add a height, so you can see that this is just the Musgrave texture. Now we can also add 2 or more textures. For instance, in this I added Voronoi texture. I add a Voronoi texture to this Musgrave texture. Now what will happen is, since this is image, these are image textures, we can add a color mix RGB node, and we can add one here and the other here, and we can in the FAC, and we can add this here in the FAC. So essentially it will be a mixture of this, and we can also control this mix RGB with a noise texture. So it will have both the effects in different kinds of settings. Now we can always change colors here. I can add a nice mixture of Voronoi and Musgrave, and we can do any more mixings. We can add another mix shader here and mix another noise texture maybe with this. So this is pretty advanced as it is, but I might go into more advanced concepts later on. And now comes the gradient texture. So this gradient texture is quite simple. You can choose different kinds of transition between colors or any other setting. Like if we choose this spherical and add a bump, and it just gives different light from different angles. You can use this for static objects if you want the lighting to do something like this, and maybe rotate the texture. And you can combine it with other effects as well. Like for instance, I combine this texture with Voronoi. Now this blue and light blue colors would be mixed with a mix RGB node, And if I now this is evenly. Now I want the gradient texture to have just a little bit effect. So yeah, this is pretty much about the gradient texture which I can tell you. Now let's move on to the magic texture. And now magic texture is also, it has different options. For instance, I can make it big or small. Now this can also be combined with different other textures to make very nice effects. We can add different amounts of distortion and this magically transforms into distorted sections. And so yeah, this is also pretty useful in maybe sci-fi environments or decorative textures. So we can also add a color ramp in between to make it black and white, and then choose colors according to our design. This can be an organic pattern, and if you combine it with a nice texture and a wave texture, okay, and mix RGB. So we get another magical texture combined with the wave texture, and if we control it with a noise texture and make it 20, so we can also combine a nice texture and add a wave texture as a fact. So different effects, and we can use a vector bump straight into the diffuse and put this in height to get a bumpy effect. Now we can also use the colors which were present to give this nice effect. And that's about it. You can do other things with it, just experiment. For instance, you want the wave texture to have very little influence, so you can just keep it to a minimum, and now this noise texture would have more of an influence. And if you want the opposite, now the noise texture has very little influence. Now if you want both to have an influence, you can just add them. Now you can see that the magic texture is also visible, and on top of it, it has this bumps of the noise texture. So I'll keep them to low, and I'll go with my colors and add a few different colors. So it can be modified this way as well. Nothing spectacular, but you get the idea. Okay, next comes the checker texture. This works well for any checkered patterns like a chessboard or maybe walls, and I'll demonstrate this on a sphere, but I'll later on demonstrate on cubes as well. So I'll go with the generated, I'll go with the object. So best would be to unwrap it first, and I'm going to take this cube and marker scene U and unwrap it. Now if I go into render mode and use UV here and increase the scale to 20, now you can see that it's unwrapped. It still has a seam, or we can use sphere projection as well. So now it's perfectly unwrapped. Okay, so we can do other settings for this, other things like making this, and again we can add a vector bump. And make it 100. You see that this also becomes bumpy. And we can also add a height map. We can use the same we can add a mix RGB node and set it to multiply, and set it to multiply as well with 4, and now as you can see that the brick texture is also okay. So we'll use something else on this. As you can see that we can also use the multiply node to have bump effects. Displace node, I mean, this displacement is similar to this displacement, but it does not change the amount of vertices. But it's not that visible because I use UV for this. Okay, I'll discuss the displace node a little later on. If for some reason it's not working here, I'll just use a wave texture and I'll add it to a bump. And I'll use that in bumps. UV, and in place of wave I'll add a noise texture. And make it 200. So this works well on walls, for example. So if I add a new mesh cube and make it like a wall and add the same material to it, and cube projection. So if I add vector mapping node and if I increase the Y to 4 and Y to 2 and X to 0.4, 0.25. So now we have a brick wall kind of a thing. So yeah, but for brick we can also use the last texture which I'm going to show you, which is the brick texture. So I'm going to delete this and add a texture called a brick texture to it, and move it. Now again I'll add the factor displacement. Now this works well. I can change the color. Now we can change the frequency. And first of all we can decrease the mortar size to 0.01. Now this will make it thin. 0.004 also. And now the bump effects are looking good. And we can increase the brick width to 0.5, 0.35. Okay, we can increase or decrease the row height as well. So in place of using this vector mapping node, we can also directly increase or decrease this. Okay. change the frequency. This is our brick wall. Now these were the basic textures. Now I'll work with the checker texture a little bit more. This time I'll add a Musgrave texture to it and add a color mix RGB node, and as you can see, now with the checker texture we have a Musgrave texture, and we can use all sorts of effects on it, like add, difference, divide. So this is a whole new section, and dimension. So screen. Now we can also do like we used to do before, like we did before, and add a texture, nice texture as the fact of it. So it will be applied only to those areas. Add. Okay, so this concludes the tutorial on how to create procedural materials. This was the basic edition. I'll keep on posting advanced materials such as this wooden floor, like I'll post dirt, terrain, and I'll post water material, and I'll post floor material. I'll post floor material is simple, it can be done using a checker texture, and also a brick texture. So then we can also do other textures. I'll come over it. Alright, so thanks for watching this tutorial. Stay tuned for the next one. Bye.